Hi, everyone. So the current title of my project is Story Worlds and Spatial Narratives, an eco-narratological analysis of storing extinction responding to the loss of North Idaho's mountain caribou. And as the title suggests, this is an eco-narratological reading of the deep mapping project that Jack and I have been working on about the recent extirpation of Idaho's mountain caribou. And my thesis right now is that through its use of collective narration, multifocalization, and representations of time and space, more generally, storing extinction creates a sense of ethical proximity and entanglement with caribou extinction through implicating viewers in an interactive and immersive story world that dissolves the boundaries between the real and the narrated. And the major narratological concepts that I'm interested in working with here so far are the idea of collective narration, which I'm drawing from Jeanette's chapter on voice to explore, multifocalization, iterative frequency, and interactivity and immersion, which are two concepts from an essay by Mary Laurie Ryan on virtual reality and literary theory. So I'm beginning this essay by talking about and bringing up the call from environmental humanities scholars that Erin addresses in her work in both the Story World Accord and eco-narratology in the Anthropocene to unsettle the dominant narratives that until now have contributed significantly to the way that we kind of imagine ourselves in relation to the natural world, and therefore the way that we behave toward it as well. And these scholars call for an unsettling of dominant narratives and the popularization of new narratives that are calibrated to the realities of our changing world. And so one of the things that eco-narratology does is pursue non-traditional representations of the environment, and through employing narratological concepts can explore different representations of the environment in a wider range of texts, as Erin does in the Story World Accord with post-colonial literatures. And what interests me about this call to unsettle the dominant narrative is its relation to a similar call by critical geographers in the latter half of the 20th century to rethink the ways in which our spatial imaginaries, or the ways that we imagine space and imagine ourselves in space, have been conditioned in large part by maps. And many of these scholars point to the ways in which traditional European style maps have presented an understanding of space as a surface. And that understanding of space is one that both creates a sense of ourselves as separate from the natural world, and it also creates an understanding of the environment as somehow static, which has many, many implications for settler colonialism, extractive industries, etc. And so kind of an underlying argument that I'm making in this paper is that the spatial narratives of cartography have been as instrumental to our environmental imaginaries as the canonical texts and narratives that environmental humanities scholars are now attempting to unsettle and decenter. The spatial narrative should therefore be taken seriously by environmental humanists and narratologists engaged in the project of communicating and encouraging alternative spatial and environmental practices. And since our project is producing a deep map or a spatial narrative, the question then becomes, what does a deep map have to offer eco-narratology, or what can an eco-narratological reading of the deep map offer environmental humanists or eco-critics? And my response to this question is that unlike traditional texts, the ones that have been the primary focus of eco-criticism and eco-narratology to this point, that allow readers to imaginatively participate in story worlds and kind of embody alternative environmental experiences, a deep map kind of breaks the boundaries between the real and the narrated in such a way that allows participants or users or viewers to situate themselves actually within the story world. And therefore it creates a sense of proximity to the narrative in question that isn't offered or possible when dealing strictly with novels or fictional story worlds. And so in their introduction to deep maps and spatial narratives, David Bodenhamer, John Corrigan, and Trevor Harris state that deep maps offer a reflexivity that acknowledges how engaged human agents built spatially framed identities and aspirations out of imagination and memory, and how the multiple perspectives constitute a spatial narrative that complements the prose narrative traditionally employed by humanists. The deep map offers eco-narratology richer, more nuanced narrative geographies that resist the kind of closure inherent to traditional texts. They do not seek authority or objectivity, as Bodenhamer and colleagues write. Rather, they provoke negotiation between insiders and outsiders, experts and contributors over what is represented and how. Through their ongoingness and their participatory nature, deep maps allow readers to not just imaginatively participate in story worlds, but to literally become and realize they have always been part of them. So one of the ways, the narratological concepts that I'm using to explore the process of immersion or inclusion in the story world is the idea of collective narration. And this is focused mostly on the oral history component of our project. A video from which I'm going to show now.
My name's Debbie Ackley, and I live in Bonners Ferry, and I've lived here since the late 70s. And I really like to hike a lot, and so my friend and I hike all over everywhere. And one day, it was October 24th, 1991, we went up to Two Mouth Lakes. There was 6 inches of snow on the ground when we got up near the pass that goes over to the lake, and I was walking really fast because I had only cotton socks on, and my friend had wool, and so she was walking slower. And I came around a corner, and out from this rock a caribou stepped, and it stood there, and I watched it, and it watched me, and it was several minutes that it just kind of stood there. And
so that's one of roughly 20 oral histories that we've included in this deep map, each one geolocated in the particular space where the caribou encounter happened, and each one contributing significantly in their own way to the larger spatial narrative, which is about caribou extinction in North Idaho. And I'm drawn to this quote by Jeanette in his chapter on voice, where he describes the narrating situation as a complex web of connections among the narrating act, its protagonists, its spatiotemporal determinations, its relationship to the other narrating situations involved in the same narrative, etc. And I'm curious about pursuing kind of the way in which we have multiple narrative instances and how having multiple narrators can allow us to build on this idea of the narrating situation as a complex web. And because the deep map is open-ended and allows people to continue to submit videos or oral histories or any kind of documentation or stories related to caribou extinction, this web is also open-ended. And so the narrating situation is one that extends far beyond even what is presented there in the moment of viewing. So 2 other concepts I'm using to explore this idea of the expansion of the narrative web and the inclusiveness of the story world are multifocalization and iterative frequency. And I'm using these to look at the game camera footage that we have from specific locations in former caribou habitat that capture both human and non-human agents as they pass through specific locations. And I'm saying that game camera footage from these locations reveals a spatiotemporal layering by focalizing an iterative event through various agents. And by doing so, it depicts a space as a meeting up of trajectories and histories, with one of these histories being hauntingly absent. And I'm focusing specifically on one location in the Ball Creek drainage, this old growth cedar tree, which is depicted on the right-hand side of the screen, that has multiple videos of animals using this tree as a communication device, and then a family coming up and discussing the way in which those trees used to be cut down in the 1800s for logging. And because the cedar tree is fundamental to the early winter habitat of caribou, it's a really interesting example of kind of the overlapping of these sociocultural and biological worlds. And all of this is supposed to end by arguing for an increased sense of interactivity and immersion. And I'm going to use Mary Laurie Ryan's concepts here to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, but basically arguing that as a multimedia online platform, Storing Extinction is a virtual space that allows users a certain degree of control over the narratives unfolding. The deep map's multiple narrative levels create a sense of immersion through expanding the story world into the larger spatial context within which users can situate themselves. The map's open-ended nature, the constant possibility for users to contribute to the narrative, allows them to cross into the story world and become a contributor to the narrative itself.